August the 28th, 1940. A concrete apron at Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, 100 kilometers northwest of Berlin. A Hawker Hurricane sits on the grass, with British roundels still visible under a hurried coat of gray paint, and a technical officer in Luftwaffe overalls walks around it with a torch and a set of calipers. He is not here to fly it. The flying is already finished. Major Werner Mölders, Commodore of Jagdgeschwader 51, the most successful fighter pilot alive on either side of the channel, has already taken it up, already landed, already written his verdict, and that verdict has already gone out to every fighter unit under Luftflotte 3. Good-natured, turns well, decidedly inferior to the Me-109, heavy on the stick, lazy on the ailerons. Case closed, as far as the pilots are concerned. This officer's job is different and slower and far less glamorous. He is here to find out what the aircraft is actually made of, and why British squadrons keep sending machines like this back into the fight 2 days after they come home holed like a sieve. He runs a hand along the rear fuselage and feels fabric over a steel frame, patched more than once already. RAF repairs laid over RAF repairs. He is a composite of the men who really did this work at Rechlin that summer. That will be said plainly again before this video ends. But the aircraft under his hand is real. The trial that produced Mölders' verdict is real. And the question he is asking is the one this whole story turns on. Not how does it fly, what does it cost to break, and what does it cost to fix? Pause on that question, because it is one the pilots never had to answer, and it turns out to matter more than any of them knew. Part 1. What Sydney Camm actually built. Go back to a factory floor at Brooklands in 1935. The Hawker Hurricane first flew on the 6th of November that year, with Hawker's chief test pilot George Bullman at the controls. Its designer, Sydney Camm, had spent the previous decade building biplane fighters for the Royal Air Force, the Fury, the Hart, the Demon, and when the Air Ministry finally asked for a monoplane fast enough to catch a modern bomber, Camm did not start from a blank sheet. He took everything Hawker already knew how to build and adapted it. What came out of that was a fuselage built around a Warren-girder frame, high-tensile steel tube, braced diagonally so the loads run through a lattice of triangles instead of a single stressed skin. Forward of the cockpit, light alloy panels over the engine. Aft of the cockpit, doped fabric stretched over wooden formers. The same covering technique Hawker had used on biplane wings for 15 years, now wrapped around a fighter's spine. By 1940, the wings themselves were metal on almost every frontline Hurricane. That needs saying clearly, because the popular wood and canvas version of this story gets the wings wrong. It is the rear fuselage that matters here. It is the rear fuselage an engineer at Rechlin would have run his hand over. None of this was romantic. It was a manufacturing decision dressed as an engineering one. Hawker already owned the jigs and the skilled fabric and tube workforce from a decade of biplane orders, and a steel tube fighter built this way could be tooled and delivered to squadrons faster than a stressed skin aluminum design starting from nothing. In 1935, the Air Ministry needed numbers in the air more than the most modern possible airplane, and it was willing to trade a few miles an hour of top speed for a factory floor that could actually deliver on time. That one unglamorous choice, made years before anyone had heard of Rechlin or the Battle of Britain, is the thread this whole story keeps pulling on. Part 2. Rechlin, and the report that never told the full story. This is not speculation. It survives on paper. Under the authority of Ober der Luft, Führungsstab 1A, reference KR-Fernschre, Ober der Luft, Führungsstab 1A, number 8092/40GK, Erprobungsstelle Rechlin ran a comparative trial between the Bf-109E, the Bf-110C, and captured examples of 3 Allied fighters, the Spitfire, the Hurricane, and the French Curtiss H-75. The findings went out as a bulletin, LFL.KDO.3, Fur.ABT.IA.OP.1, number 3951/40 grams.KDOS. Signed by Kohler, circulated to every Jagdgeschwader and Zerstörergeschwader under Luftwaffe 3, with instructions that the results were to shape air combat behavior immediately. Mölders' words on it survive, quoted by the historian Alfred Price. It was very interesting to carry out the flight trials at Rechlin with the Spitfire and the Hurricane, both types very simple to fly compared to our aircraft, childishly easy to take off and land. The Hurricane good-natured, turning well, but its performance decidedly inferior to the Me-109, strong stick forces, lazy on the ailerons. The bulletin backed him up with numbers. At sea level, the Hurricane and the Curtiss were reckoned around 60 kilometers an hour slower than the Bf-109E. Climb to 4,000 meters, 4 minutes 24 seconds for the German fighter, 5 minutes 36 for the Hurricane. On paper, a clean German win. In the air, that summer, mostly a true one. Here is what that bulletin was never built to answer, because answering it was never its job. What happened to that same class of captured airframe once the flying stopped and it went to Rechlin's other departments, the ones that dealt with structures, armament, materials? Rechlin was never only a flying field. It had technical sections whose whole purpose was to ask a duller, harder question than how does it fly. Their question was closer to, what does this cost to build, and what does it actually take to put it permanently out of the war? Rechlin itself had existed since the 1920s, growing from a small proving ground into the Luftwaffe's central test and evaluation establishment, with separate departments for airframes, engines, armament, and radio equipment, each staffed by career engineers rather than serving pilots. A captured aircraft did not pass through Rechlin once. It passed through it in stages, handed from one department to the next, each one interested in a different question, each one filing its own report up its own chain. The flight report that reached Mölders' desk and the technical report that reached the structures department were never guaranteed to end up read by the same officer, let alone summarized together for anyone above them. Part 3. The repair problem Germany did not have. This is the center of the story, and the point where it stops belonging to Mölders. A fabric and tube fuselage breaks differently to a stressed skin one. Put a cannon shell through a Bf-109's aluminium skin, and you have very likely compromised the load path of an entire panel. The fix needs a trained sheet metal crew, jigs, sometimes a replacement section flown in. Put a rifle-calibre bullet through a Hurricane's fabric rear fuselage, missing the steel tube underneath, and a rigger can patch it in the time it takes to brew tea twice over, with nothing more than needle, dope, and a length of linen from squadron stores. This is not invented for effect. It follows from the plain mechanics of the two structures, and it matches the pattern noted again and again in post-war accounts of fighter command maintenance that summer. Hurricane squadrons returning battle-damaged aircraft to readiness faster than Spitfire units taking comparable damage. Say this on screen honestly. The exact comparative numbers vary between sources, and there was never one clean wartime statistical report the way the Rechlin flight trial was. The pattern is documented. The precise percentage is not, and this video will not invent one. Think about what that pattern means for an Air Force fighting over its own ground, flying several sorties a day against an opponent stretched to the edge of its fuel range. An aircraft back in the line within hours, not days, is not a maintenance footnote. It is combat capacity, manufactured for free out of a decision Sydney Camm made 5 years earlier, for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. Every Hurricane patched over lunch and flying again that afternoon is a sortie the Luftwaffe has to fight for a second time, against a squadron it believed that morning it had already thinned out. This, very plausibly, is what would have troubled a careful German technical assessment more than the climb rate ever could. Because it is not a number you can out-engineer with a faster fighter next year. It is a philosophy built into the airframe from the drawing board, and German industry, tooled at enormous cost for stressed skin duralumin construction on both its fighters and the overwhelming majority of its bombers, had no fast way to copy it, and no time to try in the middle of a battle it expected to win in weeks. There is a smaller, human-scale version of the same point worth holding on to. A Bf-109 pilot shot down over Kent and taken prisoner was gone from the order of battle for good. A Hurricane pilot who put his aircraft down wheels up in a Kentish field, uninjured, could be back at his squadron by evening, and his aircraft, if it was not burned out, could very often follow him within days. The airframe's fabric skin and the pilot's own survival were not connected by anything Sydney Camm designed on purpose, but in the accounting that decided who won a battle of attrition. Both were the same kind of asset, men and machines that came back. Part 4. 8 guns that were not enough, and the fix that was. 8 Browning machine guns, 4 to a wing, firing rifle-calibre .303 ammunition, harmonized to converge ahead of the aircraft. Against another fighter, lightly built, this was a lethal battery. Against German bombers with armor around the crew and self-sealing tanks, pilots on both sides of the channel began noticing the same thing from opposite ends of it. Hurricanes and Spitfires hitting Heinkels and Dorniers again and again, sometimes for whole minutes of sustained fire, without bringing them down. Fighter Command's answer came inside the battle itself, not after it. From August 1940, the same month as the Rechlin trial, RAF squadrons began receiving a new incendiary round, officially the .303 SAT/B, known to the pilots who fired it as De Wilde, after the Belgian engineer credited with the compound. Designed for a visible flash and a stronger incendiary effect against exactly the fuel system's standard ball ammunition was failing to defeat. Be precise about what can honestly be claimed here. No surviving German document found for this story draws a straight line from "we examined this captured Hurricane's ammunition" to "therefore we changed how our bomber crews were briefed." What can be said is that the weakness was real and visible in the airframe to anyone with a torch and the training to look, and that the RAF's own response to that same weakness, arriving in the same month the Hurricane sat at Rechlin, is solidly documented. Where the German side of the reaction is inferred, rather than sourced, say so, plainly, and move on. Pilots on both sides wrote about this gap long before any engineer put a name to it. German bomber crews came home from raids describing fighters that had clearly hit them, sometimes repeatedly, and yet flown onto base. RAF fighter pilots, filing their own combat reports, described the same encounters from the other direction. Long bursts, visible strikes, a bomber that stubbornly refused to go down. 2 air forces were independently writing up the same physical problem in the same summer, in different languages, for different reasons, and neither side's account was wrong. Part 5. The armor that arrived late. One more thing an engineer with a torch would have logged, and a pilot flying purely for handling notes might have passed over. Armor plate behind the seat, and a bullet-resistant windscreen ahead of it, both retrofitted after the losses of the Battle of France in May and June of 1940. Early hurricanes had neither. By high summer, both were becoming standard, squadron by squadron, as fast as supply could manage it. To a technical assessor, that detail says something the flight trial never could. It says the Royal Air Force was learning inside the shape of its own campaign, in real time, and pushing that learning straight down to squadron-level modification without waiting for a new mark of aircraft to be designed and delivered through the normal peacetime cycle. That is not a flying quality. It is a production and feedback capability, and it is exactly what a structural inspection at a place like Rechlin existed to notice and pass upward. Part 6. The Verdict. Bring it together and resist inventing a single document that does not exist to make the ending tidier. The pilot's verdict on the Hurricane, filed in August 1940 and sent promptly down to fighter units, was dismissive of its performance, and it was right to be. Mölders was not wrong about the climb rate or the stick forces, but raw performance was never the whole of what kept a fighter force able to contest the sky through an entire summer of attrition. Repairability. Ammunition revised mid-battle. The speed at which a squadron could absorb its own losses and put damaged aircraft straight back into the line. None of that was a question a stick and rudder comparison at Rechlin's flying field could ever answer. It was exactly what the structural and armament sections existed to ask instead. What should unsettle anyone who reads the whole technical picture, not just the flight report Mölders is remembered for, is this. A fighter the Luftwaffe's own best pilot rated as second rate in the air was by 3 separate and independently documented measures: repair turnaround, ammunition effectiveness revised under fire, and rapid field-level survivability fixes, quietly closing the exact gap that flight trial insisted was there. This was never a dramatic, secret verdict sitting in a locked drawer in Berlin, waiting 80 years to be found. It sits in plain sight, across several perfectly ordinary wartime records that were never filed together, in 2 different languages, by 2 air forces that never had reason to compare notes. Read that the way it deserves to be read. Nobody in the summer of 1940 needed to hide this pattern from the Luftwaffe's high command. It seems nobody in Berlin ever fully joined it up at all. That is not a failure of any one man's competence. It is a failure of the kind that large, compartmentalized institutions produce almost by default. A flying report and a structural report, both accurate, both filed correctly, both read carefully by the people whose job it was to read them, and never once placed side by side by anyone with the authority to ask what they meant together. If a relative of yours served with Fighter Command that summer, or worked the fabric shops and repair sections that kept these aircraft flying between sorties, their name and their unit are worth leaving in the comments. That is one of the ways this memory survives. I should say plainly, before this ends, that the engineer at the start of this video is a composite, built from the documented 2-track process at Rechlin, flight evaluation on one side and structural assessment on the other, rather than from one named man. The trial is real. The report is real. The construction, the repair pattern, the ammunition, the armor retrofits, all of it is documented, independently, in the sources this script drew from. Where the German record is silent on a specific captured airframe's technical file, this video says so rather than filling the gap with invention. Subscribe to British Bastion for more of these. The engineering and intelligence history told from the documents, not the highlight reel.